HARK! We are here. It is time for yet another episode of Regroup Phase. Last week, our video covered my experiences in local events with Captain Rex and General Grievous. Captain Rex, not so good. General Grievous, technically not a positive winning record, but actually had a lot more fun than the Captain Rex deck. So this week, we're going to continue with that Grievous deck. We're going to show my iterations. We're going to show my game plans. We're going to show what the different things are as it happened. I have two events to go over. I have one 3-round event on Wednesday and another 3-round event that was on Saturday. So we're going to go over the Wednesday event first, plus the beginning of the deck list. Then we'll go over the Saturday event with that deck list as well, because we did make changes between events to try to iterate a little bit more on this deck as we go forward. So we're still running Grievous Green. We're still running Energy Conversion Lab, but let's check out this deck list here real quick. I have the deck list image here that was set up before the event started. This is the exact list I was running card for card, including the sideboard and the specific maneuvers. Grievous, Energy Conversion Lab, 25 health. First point of order, this 25 health actually lost me 2 games, even though the Energy Conversion Lab was a very successful use of the ability. The 25 health is very difficult to deal with, especially in games that involve things that can either bypass any of the stuff that I have or can just put more pressure on the board than I can. But with the list itself, main deck, we have 2 Political Pressure, 3 Confederate Courier, 3 Pog the Lesser, 3 Separatist Commando, 3 Droid Deployment, 3 Droid Commando, 2 Unnatural Life, 3 Battle Droid Escort, 3 Subjugating Starfighter, 3 Rush Clovis, 3 On the Doorstep, 2 Grievous's Wheelbike, 3 Overwhelming Barrage, 3 Kraken, 3 Tactical Droid Commander, 3 Hailfire Tank, 3 Invisible Hands, 2 Separatist Super Tanks. The sideboard consists of 3 Soulless Ones, 1 Political Pressure, 3 General's Guardians, and 3 Geonosius Patrol Fighters. So my listing here, my little notes, 3 rounds, I ended up going 1-2, so 1 win, 2 losses. But I believe, with the exception of the center, my round 2 matches, that they could have gone either way. Including the games that I ended up winning. So the first round, I went up against a Darth Maul yellow 30 health base. I was able to control my opponent's units, and they were not able to get as much value out of their overwhelm that they would have preferred to be able to do so. It was basically, my opponent was suffering from not having a certain amount of units. We did end up playing 3 full games. My opponent did win the 3rd game after I 2-0'd them in the actual event itself. And they got their big play of being able to slam down a Darth Maul. I was not able to clear my side of the board enough to be able to stop my opponent from using their leader ability to overwhelm Darth Maul with a saber onto 2 of my droids, which is a big problem for this deck. If your opponent has a lot of overwhelm that they can easily get access to, or even just a quick wrecker with the extra damage, this deck suffers a lot. And I did lose in the 3rd round to that combo. My notes even say wrecker sad face as a result of that. But I think that being able to deal with a wider array of overwhelm, and not necessarily overwhelm units that are very strong by themselves, such as Wrecker. So smaller units that are hoping to be able to get that overwhelm damage onto the opponents are not that big of a problem for me, even though it is something that does really mess with the battle droids. Being able to basically control my opponent using things like Separatist Commando with the ECL, or just ambushing out the droid commandos and stopping them from being able to use their overwhelm ability first is very handy, and that's how I came out 2-0 against the Maul Yellow. Round 2 was against a Dooku Blue. So this was the battle of the droid armies. My opponent was also mostly playing droid enablers and exploiters and stuff like that. They were able to exploit a little bit better than me because they had the ability to exploit any of their units, at least once per turn, with the Dooku ability. On blue, they had the control, so I made a really big play to be able to drop this Separatist Super Tank, and I'm like, cool, I'm going to get this on the board, and next round I'll be able to do something with it. It was my only unit on the board, and my opponent had Power of the Dark Side in hand, and I basically lost the game on the spot right there. I did end up winning. Actually, I didn't end up winning the 2nd game, but I got close to it. However, my opponent was able to, at the perfect time, both times drop Overwhelming Barrages to wipe out my entire board. And even after getting my board set up the 2nd time, as a joke, but only a half-hearted joke, I said to my opponent, if you have Overwhelming Barrage in your hand, I'm going to flip this table. They didn't play it that turn, but they did play it the 2nd turn, which I was less mad about because at least I had an opportunity to try to utilize my board in that moment. So there are a couple of interesting things. This deck is very susceptible to control, especially if you get those big units on the board and you don't have the ability to get the value out of them. That's kind of why I try to save things like the Tactical Droid Commander or the Separatist Commando for an Energy Conversion Lab shot. shot, which does generally work, especially if I can knock out one of my opponent's units that has 4 health or less with both of those while having another separatist unit on the board. Still haven't been able to do the ACL Kraken into my opponent with a bunch of droids on the board. That would be pretty funny, but I haven't had the opportunity to do that. Unnatural Life has come up a couple of times, but I ended up resourcing that more often than not. I have an idea of what I might do with this. It might still stay in the main board, but the sideboard has changed a little bit to reflect the opportunity for me to use something in place of Unnatural Life that might give me just as much power in that as I would have otherwise. Subjugating Starfighter worked really well. I didn't go up against any space units that have 4 or more health. So that means the Subjugating Starfighter, its ambush is able to clear out whatever unit I needed to clear out, which is fantastic. I did ambush Rush Clovis at least once during this event, which was fun. On the doorstep, I got out a couple of times. This one, I love this card, but I'm thinking about changing it up for some other stuff. Something that either can help me recur or something that can give me a little bit more control. Grievous's wheel bike has not come up as often as I want it to. Realistically, I could put it on any of my units to get that overwhelm and the +3/+3, but it hasn't really helped as much as I want it to do. Not even necessarily trying to hold it for Grievous as long as possible, but anytime I had the Grievous's wheel bike in hand, I needed the other cards on my hand more, and I had to resource the wheel. So in my round 3, I did go up against an Anakin ECL deck, which I did take the loss to. Wrecker Sadface. There was a lot of interesting shenanigans my opponent was able to use with the Anakin being able to overwhelm into my droids. Again, I wasn't able to maneuver my units or exploit them in such a manner that my opponent couldn't just get a super easy value out of some stuff, but I was able to counter a little bit of play with Anakin by presenting threats that Anakin would die to if attacking, even if they do overwhelm me, things like the Hailfire tank or potentially something like the tactical droid with an extra bonus, or I've rammed something else into the Anakin in order to be able to stop that. Political pressure didn't really come up all that much. That's one of those cards that I think is very good, but might actually end up needing to be a sideboard card against decks that I want the disruption against. So we'll have to see exactly how that ends up working. I still like the deck. I still think it's a good concept. I still think there's some fun stuff here. There also might be some fun stuff with Grievous Blue, but as it stands, there have been some changes made to this deck. We'll go over those at the beginning of the next tournament recap, but going 1-2 in this event still doesn't feel as bad as going basically 2-1 with the bye with Rex, because it was all blowouts, or going up against decks that weren't necessarily as strong as they could have been with that Rex deck. Whereas this, I'm going up against the decks that have some meta relevance. Dooku Blue has some meta relevance. Anakin ECL has some meta relevance. I think ECL is a risky choice, but my opponent plays it well enough that they're able to make those maneuvers and do some cool stuff with that. Shout out to Ian. Very fun opponent, very cool person to interact with over here locally. There are some changes made. I'm still a little up and down on Kraken. I like the ability of getting those extra droids, and if he survives, being able to on attack to pump those droids, but a 3 of may not necessarily be necessary. Love the tactical droid commander. I can bring this down for 1 by sacrificing 2 droids and then have another 2 resources to do whatever else I want with it, which is interesting. Poggle the Lesser is a card that I've found that is actually uniquely underperforming in this deck, and that is very interesting to me. I know one of the reasons why is because generally when I get Poggle, it's when I have things like droid deployment and on the doorstep and not other units to drop. But we'll have to see exactly how things end up. I did make some movement on the lower end of the board and a little bit of the higher end of the board, and we're going to take a look at those here in just a second. But I wanted to make some decisions that might give me more play into more decks moving forward, and while still giving me, I think, some strength to be able to take out decks at the same level and maybe some gameplay into Django Tarkin Town, which I've yet to play with this deck, and I'm not super confident, but I'm not unconfident. After the interesting event that we had on Wednesday, I did another 3-round, almost a 4-round event on Saturday, which I have a little bit of the listings here. We're going to go over really quick the small amount of changes that I made to the deck overall, including main board and sideboard deck changes, and then I'll tell you exactly what my record was during the event. So, on Saturday, we switched over to the same deck we were playing, but a very minor amount of changes. You guys can compare the list between before and after. It doesn't really matter. The big changes were I added Admiral Piet to the main board. I added 2 sneak attacks to the sideboard. I switched out Poggle the Lesser from the sideboard and moved it to the main board. And then I did drop 1 General's Guardian from the sideboard to down to 2 from 3. So the deck looks effectively the same, just a couple of tech choices here and there. Overall, on the event for the second day, the Saturday, I went 1-2. Technically, the one victory I had was an unforced buy, which is unfortunate. But in round 1, I went against an Anakin Yellow, which was very aggressive, a very aggressive deck. And honestly, I won game 1, but I lost the next 2 games because my opponent was able to shift their strategy into dealing with the units that I had on board. They were doing that anyway, but they spent more of the actual Anakin abilities to clear some of my bigger units off the board, and then Mace Windu from set 1 does some absolute work on the droids that I can generate and makes it so that it's very difficult to get exploits into the field. I did test to see if swapping in from the sideboard sneak attack over Unnatural Life would help me, and it didn't end up being used at all. There were a couple times where it was like, it was in my hand and I had the play ready to make, but it wasn't the right play to make, and that's super disappointing. Like I said, round 2, unforced buy. The person I was supposed to play against dropped from the event, and Melee did not register that drop as an actual drop, so it gave me and actually another player a bye, which is unfortunate, but it is the situation. Round 3, I went up against a Dooku Blue. Played this person before, but this was a different deck than they played the last time that I played them. They did 2-0 me, unfortunately. I understand that all of these records are showing that I'm basically losing all of my matches, but the matches are generally very, very close. 1 or 2 attacks here and there, or 1 correct move here and there ends up making it so that I could win. And I think that's one of the main problems of this deck, is that it doesn't really have enough gas in order to be able to really push through that victory. It doesn't need to be a convincing victory in my mind. It just needs to be a victory across the board. So game 1, I actually was winning pretty much the entire game. And right when it came down to that, I had all the winning pieces on board. Grievous with the wheel bike. I had another big unit. I had a couple of other things ready to go. My opponent was able to drop a Malevolence, which didn't do anything on the round that it came out, but on the next round, they were able to attack with the Malevolence to restore some of the health off their base, and they were able to Rivals Fall my Grievous with the wheel bike, so I wasn't able to do enough damage with Grievous to be able to push through that win. Effectively, one answer won my opponent the game, and that's very frustrating overall. The second game just was a war of attrition. They managed to have more gas than I did. The Malevolence being on their side of the board was very strong in the plays that they were able to make, even not necessarily having to exploit to get onto the board or the full exploit, just having that 7/7 with Restore 2 in space when you can see I clearly don't have enough space to be able to deal with something like that. I did have the Invisible Hand. I was able to generate some value with the Invisible Hand and getting very close to winning the game. Losing my Invisible Hand to shenanigans, Rivals Fall, other answers, so on and so forth. Having my board wiped out by Overwhelming Barrage. It's just very difficult for General Grievous himself to be able to move forward with a game plan in order to be able to do that. If I were to make some more changes, General's Guardian is not something I think we should even be in the sideboard. Same thing with Poggle the Lesser. There are other decks that utilize Poggle much better than Grievous does, but with Grievous's opening hands generally being something like Droid Deployment or the Confederate Courier, or trying to drop a Soulless one with the political pressure, having Poggle the Lesser as your start and then trying to generate the value with Exploit is very risky when your opponent can just ambush a 4-power attacker into Poggle the Lesser. My opponent in the third round, the Dooku Blue, had that Poggle, and I was able to ambush in with my Droid Commando both times to remove it off the board, and that ended up being troublesome for my opponent throughout the games played. They still won, obviously, because I wasn't able to get enough value out of what I had in my deck, but the game plan was still there to showcase that Poggle the Lesser isn't really the answer that I want it to be at the very beginning of the game. Taking General's Guardian out, taking Poggle the Lesser out, keeping the Patrol Fighter in for specific matches where I want to remove one of my opponent's 3 costs or less. Honestly, I think the Geonosis Patrol Fighter is just a Django counter. Be able to throw that Lurking Tie back to your opponent's hand, and using the ambush from Energy Conversion Lab to throw it into the P3, or in reverse. You can ambush into the Lurking Tie Phantom and throw the P3 back to hand. Sure, that gives your opponent 2 more opportunities to use that ability on that card, but they have to pay the resources in order to be able to do so. And you might not have anything left on board in order for them to use the Django effect for anyway. So I really do like this deck. I like Grievous as a whole. I think Grievous Green is a fun deck to play, which is not something I've been able to say for at least the very beginning of this set with the Captain Rex deck and any of the decks that I played in set 2, and even some of the decks I was playing towards the end of set 1. Hera, my all-time favorite. You can't see it, but her showcase is right up there. Not a fun deck to play because it's just, there's too many things that make it not good, and that's not a great feeling to have. But General Grievous has a lot of cool things to do. You can take actions, you can do some fun stuff. There are interesting combos of having Piet on the board and being able to exploit one of your big 6 cost or higher units, being able to throw that Hailfire tank or the super tank into your opponent's units with the exploit from and then the ambush from Admiral Piet is an incredible move if you can keep the Piet on the board, and it's very difficult to be able to drop that Piet and also take initiative, so that way you can use that on the next turn, or if you have enough resources, be able to do it with Piet and the Hailfire tank or the super tank in the same turn. That's a late game thing, and sometimes you just don't reach the late game. So Grievous is a fun deck. I think it could even be considered a tier 2 deck. It just doesn't have enough pieces in order to be able to interact with the tier 1 decks that exist within the set and within the game right now. And thankfully, there are quite a few tier 1 decks and not just, you know, a single one in each group. So people have opened it up to 5 different archetypes. Thankfully, there are multiple decks that run very well in each of those archetypes, and we're seeing that with some of the results in tournaments we've seen over the weekend. So what does that mean? Basically, what this means for me is Grievous is a fun deck. It is a tier 2 deck in my mind, but it's not strong enough to be able to get any wins or any good solid match wins against the tier 1 decks. And I do need to be able to have some level of competition with those decks, because locally, a lot of people are bringing their tier 1 decks to locals to get those wins and get those packs. So I need some form of competition against them in order to be able to do that, even if it's not necessarily the most fun that I could have. I do have an idea for Anakin Yellow. I have that mostly built. Just need to swap in 3 cards for an idea that I talked with one of my locals about removing from the deck that I had. I do have a mostly built double yellow Asajj Ventress deck, and that hyper aggression I think might be really cool, but it's something that I would need to do some further testing with. I have a Django deck. I'm interested in potentially trying to run Nalase Green with clones to be able to get that really nitty gritty combat style with the clones with a proper leader, as opposed to Rex, who is not a proper leader, but with Nalase getting access to all the villainy stuff, which is just insane. I think there's a deck there. There's a couple people, but I think, and those people also think there's a deck there that might end up being really, really good if piloted well, because of the diversity of deck building options that it has. But if you think you have an idea of something that I should run, let me know in the comments below. That way I can take a look at what your ideas are. And if you have a deck list, you can link those as well. That way we can see what we can work with when we're working with it, as we're working with it. Unfortunately, next week, there's not going to be any gameplay for me, any local events, because Thanksgiving week, most people have their events either canceled or changed in such a manner where it's not going to fit my schedule. That's unfortunate. And then the first week in December, I am doing at least 1 draft. Hopefully I'll be able to do 1 constructed/premiere event towards the end of that week, so I might be able to get a video out talking about some of that stuff. But anyway, I've talked a lot. I don't need to really talk too much more. Thank you for joining me, everybody. I appreciate each and every one of you. Remember, make sure you like and comment on this video. Subscribe to this Star Wars Unlimited channel for all your Star Wars Unlimited needs. Thank you for joining me for this very interesting Grievous journey. It actually went a lot better than I originally expected it was going to, but not well enough to keep going with it. It's packed away. It's basically going to go into the Hall of Fame of at least playable decks, but not necessarily winningest decks. And you know what? That's okay. So without any further ado, I am done. Thank you, folks. Appreciate each and every one. I'll see you in the next one, and I will see you in the stars.